what true worship is. Now, I want you to pay very, very close attention to what I'm about to say. Can you promise me that? Pay very, very close attention to what I'm getting ready to say. Worship is vital. Worship is important. And unfortunately, I feel like sometimes we take away from the fact that worship is one of the most important things that we do. And not only do I think that there are those who do this, I know that there are because I can see it. I can feel it. So often I feel that Christians are guilty of going through the motions during worship. When I was in high school playing baseball, I can remember on days where I was struggling at the plate especially, those 0 for 3, 0 for 4 kind of days. And I can remember after the game when Coach would sit down, he would talk to us. He would say, Chase, you went through the motions today. You went through the motions today. You have to be better tomorrow. Come ready to play tomorrow. And what he was getting at was by going through the motions, meaning that I was just kind of there. I really wasn't in sync with what was going on. I really wasn't active as far as, just really being enthusiastic about it. I wasn't really there. I was there, but I wasn't there. You know what I mean? I was going through the motion. And when it comes to worship, we need to understand how important of a thing worship is, how sacred of a thing that worship is. In fact, you've heard me say this before. The word worship in the Greek is the word proskuneo. The word literally means to fall down and kiss the feet of the one who is on the throne. I want to say that one more time to make sure that you get it. Proskuneo worship is to fall down, literally fall down, and to kiss the feet of the one who is on the throne. Well, who's on the throne? The answer is God, of course. When it comes to kissing the feet or praising God, worshiping God, understand that that's not something to take lightly. It's very, very, very important. God is a God who deserves nothing less than to be praised and worshiped. He's a God that deserves nothing less than for us to continuously be telling Him of His goodness and proclaiming His goodness and how all the amazing things that He's done in our life. God deserves nothing less than that. And so I want this to be a time of examination. When it comes to worship, are we doing it the right way? Do we have the right mindset, the right attitude? Are we doing it the right way? You could be turning to Psalm 9. That is where we will be here in just a moment. You've probably noticed that I have been in the Psalms a lot recently. In fact, my last 3 or 4 sermons have come from Psalms. And I think that's because here lately, I've really felt the need for the Psalms, I guess. There's been a lot going on, and I've enjoyed getting to dig deep into the Psalms and to see what David has to say about times when he was dealing with a lot, when there was a lot on his plate, and hearing Psalms of Moses, and Moses in the same situation when he was tired. And I've just been relating to the Psalms a lot recently, and I want to share with you what has been blessing my life. What true worship is. We mentioned John chapter 4, verse 24 so often, where Jesus in his conversation with the Samaritan woman, and as they're conversating, and she's asking him where the proper place to worship is, and she makes the comment, you Jews say that it's up on the mountain, and we worship, and they're just having this conversation back and forth, and Jesus says, woman, truly I tell you that a time is coming when those who worship God must worship Him in spirit and in truth. And I'm not going to say that we overuse that passage because I don't believe in such a thing, but I think we throw that passage around a lot, trying to affirm the things that we do as far as doctrine is concerned, and rightly so. When it comes to the way that we worship, as far as the a cappella singing, when it comes to partaking of the Lord's Supper every Sunday, when it comes to our giving, when it comes to our praying, and all of the things we do in worship as far as doctrine is concerned, those things are important. But also in that passage, you notice that Jesus says, those who worship God must worship Him in spirit and in truth. We focus so much on the truth and making sure we're doing things scripturally speaking as far as doctrine is concerned. And rightly so. Again, that is important. Very important. But equally as important is where your mind is during worship. is the way mentally and the way you approach worship, your mindset. And it has to be thought of that way. It's vital. And I've had people make the comment before that there is no wrong way to worship. That all worship is worship and that all worship is acceptable in the sight of God, and we need to stop kidding ourselves because that's simply not the case. May I suggest to you that it is definitely a possibility that we go through doctrinally and that we do things that we're supposed to do the way that God would have us to do them, doctrinally speaking. But when it comes to our mindset, when it comes to our attitude, when it comes to the way we approach worship, that we can have both of those things at the same time. We can be doing all the right things doctrinally and all the wrong things as far as our approach. If our approach is wrong and our mindset is wrong, then it's all wrong. Worship should be taken very, very seriously. And so I want you to be thinking as we're going through this sermon, I want you to be thinking, am I a person who feels this way? Or am I a person that approaches worship in this way? Let's dig in here. Number one, we need to understand that worship is deliberate, not accidental. Verses 1 and 2. It says, I will give thanks to the Lord with all my heart. I will tell of all your wonders. I will be glad and exult in you. I will sing praise to your name, O Most High. Notice the I will statements in verses 1 and 2. David says, I will give thanks. He says, I will tell of all your wonders. He says, I will be glad and exult in you. And he also says, I will sing praise to your name. Worship is something that is done intentionally. It's very deliberate. It's not something that's accidental. I say that because I want to make this point. Worship is a term that describes what disciples do when they intentionally come together to do it, if that makes sense. Worship is something, a term that describes this time that we have right now, that we're together, and we make the conscious decision to be together intentionally to worship God. Worship is not a term that describes something that can be done at any time while you are doing anything. I know there are people who like to teach that you can worship God while you're doing this, or you can worship God and during the workday doing this. You can worship God in all of these different ways, and we need to understand that that's really not the case. Worship is deliberate. Worship is intentional. It's not accidental. It's not something that can be done at any time with any people doing anything in the world. Worship is deliberate. It's not accidental. Again, I will give thanks. I will tell of all your wonders. I will do this. I will do that. Worship is very deliberate. It's not accidental. And so when you come across those people, and you will, I have, that feel like you can worship God, that word is just thrown around far too often. When you come across those people who say that you can worship in the midst of doing this and in the midst of doing this, that's simply not the case. Worship is very intentional. Secondly, worship is thoughtful. Is thoughtful, not mindless. Again, let's read verse 1. It says, I will give thanks to the Lord with all my heart. I will tell of all your wonders. I will be glad and exult in you. I will sing praise to your name, O Most High. Notice, after the I will statement, I will give thanks to the Lord with all my heart. Worship is thoughtful, not mindless. You know, when it comes to worship, and I'm very, very passionate about this, when it comes to worship, it takes a lot of concentration. And I think you know that and you understand that. Worshiping God is something that takes a very serious effort on your part to be concentrated and to be focused on what God would have you to be focused on. So I ask you this question. During worship, whether it be while we're singing, while we're taking the Lord's Supper, while we're praying, while we're going about doing all that the Scripture tells us to do, where is your mind? Is it not so easy to come to worship and your mind to be someplace else? It is it not? It would be so easy for me to have come to worship today and my mind be thinking about the funeral that I have to do tomorrow. To be thinking about the youth retreat that's going on this week. For me to be thinking about my wedding that's set to take place this Saturday. Am I excited that I'm getting married this Saturday? Absolutely. Am I excited that I get to be with the brethren all week at this youth retreat? Absolutely. I could be thinking about all the stuff that I have to do when I get home this afternoon, about how I have to pack. I have to clean this, I have to take this here, I have to take this there. I could be thinking about anything in the world I want to, and when I do that, I'm missing the point entirely. I'm missing the mark, I'm missing the point. Would you agree that it's so easy to do that sometimes? For your mind to be anywhere else during worship. It's such an easy thing to do, and if we're not careful, we'll find ourselves in that position. Where's your mind right now? At this very moment? As the Word of God is being presented to you. What are you thinking about? Worship is thoughtful, not mindless. Number 3, worship is cognizant. That is a word that means a word that is having knowledge, not ignorant. Verses 3 through 6. It says, when my enemies turn back, they stumble and perish before you. For you have maintained my just cause. You have sat on the throne judging righteously. You have rebuked the nations. You have destroyed the wicked. You have blotted out their name forever and ever. The enemy has come to an end in perpetual ruins, and you have uprooted the cities. The very memory of them has perished. Now, before I really elaborate on this point, I want to help you understand something else. We talked the last few weeks about how different psalms serve different purposes. Again, there were psalms of lament where the psalmist would write from the woes of pain and sorrow and they cry out to God. There were psalms of ascent that the Israelites would sing as they were ascending on the mountain to worship God. There were psalms of thanksgiving where the psalmist is thanking God for something that he has done or is doing in their lives. There are also psalms of praise and worship where the psalmist is doing exactly that. He's praising and he's worshiping God. There are also psalms of didactic nature. That is a psalm of teaching about God and how to live for God. This is not only a psalm of praise and worship, where David is literally praising God. This is also a psalm of thanksgiving, where in the midst of his praising and his worshiping God, that David is acknowledging and being full of thankfulness for what God has done. And that's what you're seeing in verses 3 through 6. When he's talking about all of these things that God has done, he's acknowledging the fact that God has done some pretty amazing things. When it comes to worship, do not worship in ignorance. Well, what is ignorance? Far too often people define ignorance as stupidity, and that's not what ignorance is. The word ignorant literally means not knowing or having not known. And far often I see in the way people approach worship, it's like, do you not know what you're doing? Do you not know the God that you're worshiping? When I see a person who's distracted, when I see a person whose mind is somewhere else like we've just got to be talking about, that's literally the question that goes through my mind. Do you not know who you're worshiping? Do you not know who you are in the presence of right now? That question that David presents. Also here in the book of Psalms, God, who may abide in your tent and who may dwell on your holy hill? He's asking God, who may stand before you, who may come into your presence? And then he mentions all of the things that a person in the presence of God should have. Do you not know who it is that you're worshiping? Do you not know whose presence you are in whenever you show up to the church building on a Sunday morning to worship? Do you know who it is that you're coming before? Do you know who it is that you're singing to? Do you know who it is that you're praying to? Do you know who it is that you are remembering when you take the Lord's Supper? Do not worship in ignorance. When we worship, we acknowledge all that God is and all that God has done. Worship is cognizant, not ignorant. And it must be treated that way. Number 4. Worship is directed, not aimless. You notice in verse 1, verse 7, verse 10, verse 11, 13, and 16. Verse 1 says, I will give thanks to the Lord. In verse 7 it says, but the Lord abides forever. He has established his throne for judgment. It says in verse 10, and those who know your name will put their trust in you, for you, O Lord. In verse 11 it says, sing praises to the Lord. In verse 13 it says, be gracious to me, O Lord. In verse 16 it says, the Lord has made himself known. Worship is directed. And throughout this psalm, here in Psalm 9, David is channeling his adoration to the Lord, the one that he is worshiping. You'll find this funny, I'm sure. And I kind of do now, but I didn't at the time and when I kind of began to think about it, when it was pointed out to me. When I was a young child, I can remember my parents would have me lead prayers. Or in the small congregation where I was attending when I was young, they would ask me to lead prayers. They were trying to help raise me up to serve. And I think that's a great idea. But when I was a child, 25 people in the audience, 25 people in attendance. And when I was a child, that was enough to have me trembling. My knees would be shaking. I would be sweating. I was nervous. I was scared to death to get up there and lead a prayer. Scared me to death. And I can literally remember as I'm going through my prayer that my mind was so focused on the audience. And what I was saying, I was working so hard and trying so hard to make sure that what I was saying was coming across well to the audience. But you see, I'd really missed the picture altogether. It's like I had forgotten that I'm talking to God. Do you know what I mean? Have you ever found yourself in that situation, or is that just me? Whereas you're praying, you're so focused on the audience and making sure that your prayer comes across the right way, and you forget altogether the fact that you're talking to God. How about when we're singing? And I made the point and I asked the question, do you know whose presence you are in? But when we're singing, think about it. When you're singing, you yourself, and boy, I hope you're singing. When you're singing, do you understand in that moment that those words that you are singing those in such a way, not only to each other, as Ephesians 5:19 points out, but also to God. That as those words are coming out of your mouth, that they are you're in a direct line, direct contact with God. Where's your mind? Is your worship directed? In those moments, do you understand what you're doing? Do you understand who you're really talking to? Worship is directed. We should be channeling our adoration to the Lord throughout. Number 5. Worship is rational, not meaningless. As we've been discussing, worship is very important. Very important. David, in this psalm, I think he really gives us 5 reasons. Five reasons that worship is rational, that worship is not meaningless. Number 1 is his nature. That is the nature of God. Verses 1 and 2. Again, he says, I will give thanks to the Lord with all of my heart. I will tell of all your wonders. I will be glad and exult in you. I will sing praise to your name, Most High. Next slide here. Don't mind speaking. We're going to go through here. 5 reasons given by David why worshiping God makes sense. His nature, verses 1 and 2, and also his deliverance of us, beginning in verse 3. It says, when my enemies turn back, they stumble and perish before you. For you have maintained my just cause. You have sat on the throne judging righteously. You have rebuked the nations. You have destroyed the wicked. You have blotted out their name forever and ever. The enemy has come to an end in perpetual ruins, and you have uprooted the cities. The very memory of them has perished. Thirdly, his character. The character of God described beginning in verse 7. It says, but the Lord abides forever. He has established his throne for judgment, and he will judge the world in righteousness. He will execute judgment for the peoples with iniquity. The Lord also will be a stronghold for the oppressed, a stronghold in times of trouble. And those who know your name will put their trust in you. For you, O Lord, have not forsaken those who seek you. Fourthly, his protection. Described again, backing up to verses 9 and 10. And finally, fifthly, his nearness in verse 11. It says, sing praises to the Lord who dwells in Zion. Declare among the peoples his deeds. Worshiping God makes sense, does it not? It just makes sense. What do you and I do when we see people doing things that we find admirable? Well, we be sure to thank them, first of all. You noticed in the bulletin today, and Jack alluded to it, we wanted to thank everyone for their service and for stepping up and for serving in different capacities that maybe they really aren't comfortable serving in. But because there's a need that these men are stepping up, and we've had some women do the same thing in different capacities, stepping up and serving in ways that they never thought about serving before. When we see action that is admirable, we tend to say thank you, do we not? That's what we did this morning. We want to acknowledge. You ever been to some sort of event, and you always have that behind-the-scenes person, you know what I mean? You always have that behind-the-scenes person, where during an event, they're always coming in and making sure things go smoothly, making sure things are done correctly, and the transitions and everything else. And sometimes, maybe it's at the end of a play, and at the end of the play, somebody will get up there and they will talk about the students and talk about how hard they worked for this play and making sure that they did it the right way. And then often what you'll hear them do at the very end is they'll acknowledge a person, that behind-the-scenes person, who has been working so hard without any real acknowledgement up to this point. And they acknowledge the fact that this person has worked very, very hard to make sure things go the right way, the way they intended for them to go. Because they saw this action that this person was doing as admirable, they were sure to acknowledge it. Worshiping God makes sense. Because I don't know about you, but I feel the need to acknowledge the fact that God's goodness is evident. How about you? I feel the need to acknowledge the fact that God has changed my life, has changed everything about my life. I feel the need to acknowledge the fact that I have seen other people's lives change. I feel the need to acknowledge the fact that God is transcendent. I feel the need to acknowledge the fact that God is perfect. I feel the need to acknowledge the fact that God is one who by nature is amazing. I feel the need to acknowledge that God, I was dead and you saved me. I feel the need to acknowledge that the character of God is untouched, that no one can compare to Him. I feel the need to acknowledge the fact that my God protects me when I don't deserve it. I feel the need to acknowledge the fact that God is near to me. You may be asking, what do you mean in verse 11? David says, sing praises to the Lord who dwells in Zion. David's making a point to God's people, the Israelites. Well, where do they worship? Well, of course, the temple that was there on Mount Zion. And it was known that in that place, in the Holy of Holies, that is where God was. And so as David is making reference to that place, to Zion, he's saying the Lord is near. I feel the need to acknowledge all of those things when it comes to my worship to my God. Worship is rational. It just makes sense to worship such an amazing God. Number 6, worship is emotional, not dispassionate. I could spend hours and hours and hours talking about this one point. I think this may be my very favorite thing about the Psalms, to be honest. I challenge you sometime to dig through the book of Psalms. Maybe just the Psalms of David. Maybe not even the Psalms that were written by others, but just the Psalms of David. To find those Psalms of praise and worship, or even those Psalms of thanksgiving. And look at the way David, you can just hear it in the way that he writes. A few words here, just in this psalm, in Psalm 9. Here's some other homework for you. This one will be a little easier. Just in Psalm 9, go through there and find all of the words pertaining to an emotion. The word glad appears. The word rejoice appears. The word cry appears. Think about that one. When you think about a person being emotional, what do you think of? Think about crying, don't you? When I think of someone being emotional, whenever a person says, well, they got all emotional during their speech. I mean, sure, we have other emotions, but when you hear emotional, you just think crying. All these emotions that David is alluding to in Psalm 9. It's just amazing to me how so many people, and I'm not scared to say this, so many churches of Christ, so many members and so many places in the Lord's church are going about worship in a way that's the very opposite of emotional. And I have a hard time with that. That's a hard pill for me to swallow. Worship is emotional. If you don't believe me, go through and read the Psalms. Flip over to the New Testament and the way the Lord's church goes about their worship. And you don't even see it. You can't even really hear it physically, but you can tell just by the way God's people write. Just by what they wrote, you can hear, you can sense, you can feel their emotion. As David is saying, I will cry out to you. In you I have taken refuge. Oh God, you have delivered me. You have done this. You have done that. God, I will praise you forever. God, you are an everlasting God. Is that not emotional? It's emotional. I just cannot accept the fact that we go through worship sometimes in such a way that is not emotional. In such a way that we're going through the motions, not realizing what we're doing. Worship is emotional. One of my very favorite experiences in my whole life, last year at Lariat Creek, at one of the camps that I attend in the summer. On the last day of camp, we had a guest speaker. His name is Phil Brookman. You may have heard of him. Phil Brookman is the pulpit minister at the Memorial Road congregation there in Edmond. And Phil came down and he preached a very, very, very powerful sermon. And it touched me. And apparently it touched a lot of other people too. And I'll never forget, he did something that I thought was so cool. He brought with him a cross. A wooden cross. And he set it up beside the pulpit. And as he was going through talking about all the different things he was talking about in his sermon, about what it means to let go, what it means to forgive others, what it means to forgive yourself, and what it means to do all of these different things, he addressed all of them in the sermon, and like I said, it was powerful. And after the sermon, he said, I want to do something very special. I want you to be thinking right now in your mind about some way that you're stumbling right now. Be thinking about some sin or some problem that you have that is keeping you from being all that you can be, spiritually speaking. Whether it be the fact that you're having a hard time forgiving, whether it be the fact that you're having a hard time getting in the Word, whether it be that you're having a hard time with whatever it is. He said, I want you to be thinking about the one thing that is stopping you from an intimate relationship with God right now. And he handed all of us a piece of paper and a pencil. He said, I want you to write it down. Whatever it is. He said, I don't want you to show anybody. I want this to be between you and God. I want you to write it down, whatever it is. And what I want you to do is while we're singing the song of invitation and after the fact, I want you to come up here. I want you to take that piece of paper. And I want you, and they had a hammer, several hammers, and several boxes of nails. He said, I want you to take that piece of paper and I want you to nail it to the cross. And I'll never forget that. I'll never forget the sound of that first hammer and that first nail, nailing that piece of paper to the cross that he had brought with him. The child that drove the first nail was a person who had a lot of parent issues growing up. Had a lot of issues with her father. There was a lot of disputing. There was a lot of anger. There was a lot of bitterness. You could tell just by talking to her. And I'll never forget that first person driving that first nail into the cross. And I know what it was about. She didn't tell me what was on that paper, but I knew what it was by what she said afterwards. She had been struggling for so long with this emotional, this anger, this bitterness, this hatred. It was emotional. You can imagine. And kid after kid, young people, old people alike, young and old, were coming up and they were nailing whatever it was to the cross. It was powerful. It put this image in my mind that I'll never forget, the sounds of those nails going through the wood. And I'll never forget, after we did that, we set aside a special time after that, where several of us counselors, we came up and we had prayer time. We said, if you need somebody to pray with you about whatever it is that you just nailed to the cross, if you need somebody to pray with you about something that you just don't want to go up there and nail it, if you want to talk to them, if you want them to pray with you. And we set aside a specific time for that. And I'll never forget me and several other men. I'll never forget being hand in hand, having our arms around each other and praying with child after child after child for nearly an hour. All we did was pray with these kids and pray for these kids about whatever it is that they had going on. It was powerful. It was emotional. And I'll never, ever forget it as long as I live. You see, that's what I can appreciate. I can appreciate those times when there's emotion flowing. Now, I'm not saying, I want you to be understanding, I'm being very clear, I'm wanting to be. I'm not saying you should be in tears every time you're in this building. I'm not saying you should be so overwhelmed with emotion that you're not paying attention. I'm not saying that we should go crazy, okay? That's not what I'm suggesting. But what I'm suggesting is we talk about the pattern of Scripture a lot, and when I look at the pattern of Scripture, I see lots and lots of emotion coming from those who worship God. It's an emotional time. Worship is emotional, not dispassionate. Number 7. Worship is optimistic, not despairing. Look with me, beginning in verse 11. It says, sing praises to the Lord who dwells in Zion. Declare among the peoples his deeds. For he who requires blood remembers them. He does not forget the cry of the afflicted. Be gracious to me, O Lord. See my affliction from those who hate me. You lift me up from the gates of death, that I may tell of all your praises. That in the gates of the daughter of Zion I may rejoice in your salvation. The nations have sunk down in the pit which they have made, and the net which they hid their own foot has been caught. The Lord has made himself known. He has executed judgment. In the work of his own hands the wicked is snared. The wicked will return to Sheol, even all the nations who forget God. For the needy will not always be forgotten, nor the hope of the afflicted perish forever. Arise, O Lord, do not let men prevail. Let the nations be judged before you. Put them in fear, O Lord. Let the nations know that they are but men. Worship is optimistic. Let me explain what I mean by that. Worship is optimistic, number 1, regarding enemies. Regarding enemies. We see that here in this text. All these things he talks about beginning in verse 15. It says, the nations have sunk down in the pit which they have made. And talk about how the Lord has made himself known in verse 16. Worship is done in an optimistic way. You know what it means to be optimistic, don't you? It's almost like being confident. You have this true sense of knowing that something is going to happen. Being optimistic regarding enemies, regarding those who are constantly trying to put you down. Worship is optimistic regarding the future. This understanding that God will take care. Not that there won't be hardship, but that God will see to it that you're taken care of. Optimistic, number 3, regarding comfort. The fact that God will be there to comfort you and to be your refuge, as David says over and over again here in Psalm 9. Fourthly, regarding the fulfillment of needs. My heart goes out to those who wonder where their next meal is going to come from. I can't imagine that helplessness. But for you and I, we can be optimistic, knowing that God is one who wants to fulfill our needs. And then finally, we can be optimistic regarding a covenant relationship with God. As we're worshiping, because if as we're going about our worship, if we're not optimistic, if there's doubt, if there's fear, we won't worship the way God wants us to worship. All of these things that we've mentioned. And what I was really doing, I wanted to help you understand what true worship looks like. And if any of you want a copy of my notes, I would love for you to ask. And I will do my very best to get you a copy of these notes so that you can look at these scriptures and look at these points and ideas. In fact, if you want to sit down and study it sometime, and I'll show you some different passages in the New Testament, I'd love to do that as well. I want you to understand what worship is. Here in a couple of weeks, we're going to be in Psalm 147. And we're going to be talking about 9 reasons why you should come to worship. And I'm excited about that. But before we got to that, I wanted to introduce Psalm 9 and talk about what true worship is. Worship is important. It's vital. It's a huge part of what we do. It's that magical time when we get to tell God how good He is. When we get to remember the Savior. When we get to talk to Him. Communicate back and forth. Worship is important. And we should treat it that way. Hope that you've enjoyed Psalm 9 today. And as always, we want to offer up a song of invitation. If you don't want to come forward, because we know that so often that we have no one that does that. But if you're one who says, I'll never come forward, but I really have something I want to talk about, come see me afterwards. I'd love to talk to you about it. I'd love to pray with you. I'd love to pray for you. If you're one who is sitting there and you know that you have not yet made the decision to obey the gospel and baptize into Christ Jesus, we can help you with that too. We'd love to help you with that. If you're tired, if you're weary, if you're being weighed down, whatever, we want to pray with you. We want to help you. But we can't do anything for you unless you let us know how we can help you. If that is your need, please come now as we stand.